Much academic scrutiny and consideration has been channeled towards chronicling the relationship between Friedrich Nietzsche, born 1844, and his philosophical predecessor Arthur Schopenhauer, born 1788. The two writers would influence German philosophy and the progression of Western history and thought to a very significant degree, and while sharing some similarities in their programs, they would ultimately grow in quite stark distinction towards the end. What I want to do today is trace Nietzsche's divorce from Schopenhauer, and my apologies for that marriage reference there, Arthur. Nietzsche famously first encountered one of Schopenhauer's books while he was just a student at Leipzig University, where he picked up a second-hand copy of The World as Will and Representation at a university bookshop. Reading Schopenhauer's most celebrated work, as Nietzsche would later describe, was the very seminal moment in his academic career, where he is first exposed to secularized philosophy and opens up the Pandora's box, so to speak, and finds within a world of complete and utter infinitude and complexity. Many opportunities are for the first time presented to him. Caught under the spell of Schopenhauer's atheism and his metaphysical worldview, Nietzsche quickly became one of his disciples from this point, and it's difficult not to see why, reading The World as Will and Representation. And reading Nietzsche's works immediately written thereafter, we can see each of them are written through the Schopenhauerian lens and worldview. But this is where it gets interesting. There are many points of conjecture connecting the two philosophers, but in this video I want to speak about what I think is most significant in the context of their relationship, and that is ontology, and looking at the worldview that each of them held, and their respective accounts of metaphysics, as I think this provides us the most fertile intellectual ground for analysis. And in order to get started, it's best to look at pessimism, the bread and butter of Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer famously viewed the world as separated into two distinct spheres, the world of appearance, phenomena, and representation, and beneath this world of mere representation, there lies the true world, the world of will, Kantian thing in itself, or noumena, and primordial oneness, as Nietzsche would describe. This is an ontological argument of first principles that Schopenhauer is asserting here, assuming that the world exists as the irrational, ever-striving, ceaseless will, and what we experience is an objectification of this will. As it manifests itself in creating subjectivity, the will cannot be satisfied or overcome to any meaningful extent. The only possible solution at the disposal of human beings at manipulating or affecting this will in any way is through chastity or aesthetic contemplation. Fleeting happiness might occur in this moment of manipulation, but it should be understood that this is merely fleeting, and as well occurs through a mechanism of negating the world itself. Schopenhauer's World as Will and Representation, first reaching shelves in 1818, before other expounded versions came later in 1844 and 1859 respectively, is his magnum opus, and constitutes his core philosophical project. Schopenhauer's ideas were constant through his career, and his later writings that came after The World as Will and Representation we might basically view as expounding or refining and strengthening this core and initial argument he puts forth. Nietzsche, on the other hand, would not remain nearly as homogeneous through his academic career, charting multiple philosophical developments and changes through his life, to arrive at a program in his last productive year in 1888 that was very different and distinct from that of when he began in the late 1860s, the early 1870s. The first book-length publication Nietzsche would write, however, The Birth of Tragedy, 1872, exalts the Schopenhauerian will as the true nature of being, and capitulates to the ontological claim first made by Plato, and later Kant, of containing the human experience to a world of mere representation. While Kant would repudiate the belief that humans are capable of gaining knowledge of the true world, Plato left open the prospect of some form of pure knowledge. Schopenhauer, however, detached himself from these musings and would altogether assert the will underlying the whole of reality, as will the thing in itself, and even something beyond the subject-object division, as existing in transcendental groundlessness. Nietzsche joined Schopenhauer in locating an irrational, ceaseless, blind, ever-striving will at the root of everything. Nietzsche calls this will, however, Dionysus, and he locates this as the Dionysian, the primordial oneness at the heart of reality. Conversely, all phenomena is manifested through the illusions of Apollo, he says, a force that sustains life through individuation and distance, making great efforts to divide reality and make it consumable for the human being. Nietzsche projects the quality of oneness found in Kant's true world upon Dionysus, but, like Schopenhauer, he ascribes to this figure as existing beyond our representational grasp. We might occasionally glimpse at this pit of despair at the bottom of reality, but we will never be able to represent it purely or wholly. Only a dreamlike state, really, clouded by affect and bodily forces and drives. Nietzsche and Schopenhauer thus order the nature of reality in a similar manner, and both deploy art as a response. But there is a big difference found here. Nietzsche harnesses the will as an art form in itself, and contends that awareness and active exercise of the Dionysian oneness through Attic tragedy and heroism might bring about the necessary beautification to make life worth living. While both depart from anti-teleological grounding, the salvation of life is to Schopenhauer strictly impossible. To Nietzsche, on the other hand, he says that art might be able to somehow make this realization possible. Nietzsche's Attic tragedy, as the apotheosis of art, uses the will, balanced with Apollo, to bring order and a sense of purpose to the chaos. Soon after his first publication, Nietzsche would set to work unmasking the Dionysian oneness, as he set out to transfigure the Schopenhauerian pessimism into a new worldview. A worldview not only disregarding the idea of will for its illogic, but also a worldview compatible with life. So did Nietzsche by 1876 announce, "I have to confess a difference that I have with Schopenhauer's teaching, a difference that developed quite gradually. In terms of almost all his general claims, I do not take his side." So while Nietzsche earlier on in his career did not see existence as the overwhelming surplus of pain over pleasure, but as something that we might transcend this banal existence through the utilization of art, he did not realize that at this point, that even here, the metaphysical structure of things he had affirmed beneath this conviction was unhistorical, deceitful, and altogether deficient and too small to bring about his greater project that he had in mind. Thus, at this juncture, the question is posed of Nietzsche. Can he, unlike Kant or Schopenhauer, find a way of acknowledging the reality of that transgressive impulse and its intuition of beyondness, but without succumbing to it? The philosophy that emerged from the still smouldering flames and ashes of this very reckoning with reality demonstrates Nietzsche had, in fact, become the first to re-evaluate all values, or at least attempt to, and in the process he surmounted that gripping allure of beyondness and that infectious Schopenhauerian view that was spawned by the diseases of Christian pessimism, of nihilism, and of weakness. Nietzsche's formula for the new aristocracy is laid down before us, a new sword to wield in fighting through the thicket, but it starts with the disregarding of all that lies beyond the natural world, by first examining the direction of one's metaphysical presuppositions, perhaps allowing an act of supreme self-examination on the part of humanity. I know myself to stand in opposition to the mendaciousness of millennia. I was the first to discover the truth by being the first to experience lies as lies. Soon man came to Nietzsche as no longer a being subordinated to that primordial reality, but instead a very fluid, historical, constantly striving subject that operates strictly in the realm of nature, and as such he constructs a naturalistic philosophy. Nietzsche emancipated man from the hellscape of metaphysics. Even his later will to power, which might have once been considered ontological and universal, is a construct Nietzsche locates in nature. He views it as the post-rational fabric of life, as something driving forth ethics, politics, psychology, and aesthetics, and something requiring our deep contemplation and alignment. Thus, I argue that Nietzsche abandons Schopenhauer not long after his publication of The Birth of Tragedy, where he was able to strip himself of these very strong ontological and metaphysical convictions and reorient himself towards the revaluation of all values as his project that he would soon pick up. This is not a single moment of revelation we can stylize or chart out at which this divorce occurred, but something that was an incremental process occurring through the entirety of Nietzsche's career, as he gained confidence to stand on his own 2 feet. Nietzsche's Schopenhauer as Educator essay, published in the 1874 Untimely Meditations series, praises Schopenhauer's intellectual rigor and willingness to steadfastly swim against the currents of the day. The work foregrounds Nietzsche's indebtedness to Schopenhauer, showing him what it means to be untimely and contradictory. Nietzsche writes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra of a new breed of man, prepared to embrace discipleship before leaving behind in time their teachers to blaze a trail of their own. True originality is impossible without such an act. There is also much to say too of Richard Wagner, who shared with Nietzsche an attachment to Schopenhauer. Nietzsche's separation with Wagner was simultaneous and fitted together with that of leaving Schopenhauer, as he could no longer reconcile very well Wagner's political fixations. This was a difficult and draining and very lonely process for him, but one that was necessary to bring his philosophy into something he lived out. There are many other points of a distinction that separate both Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, just as there are many other points that join the two together and we might find as some sense of agreement. But ultimately, altogether, Nietzsche would live out his own philosophies and abandon Schopenhauer as educator and philosophical influence.